Hello and welcome. Today's topic is our development of the cardiovascular system part 1. After implantation of the zygote, it grows but it requires nutrition which was supplied by the adjacent uterine vessels of the myometrium. Now these vessels gradually converts into placenta. So how placenta forms you already know. How the implantation occurs of the zygote you already know. Within few weeks this embryo starts growing faster. So the size of the embryo will become gradually bigger and bigger. So it requires more nutrition, more and more nutrition results initiation of the formation of the cardiovascular system. Now how it forms step by step. So first phase what happens? Establishment of the cardiogenic area. See, at the third week of intrauterine life, cardiac progenitor cells develops from the epiblast. What is epiblast? You already know. And this cardiac progenitor cell presents lateral to the primitive streak. What is primitive streak? You already know. Now, this cardiac progenitor cells gradually migrates towards cranially through the primitive streak and forms a horseshoe-shaped primary heart field in the splanchnopleural mesoderm. So, what is splanchnopleural mesoderm? You already know that. During head fold stage, the primary heart field area moves dorsal to the pericardial sac. Okay. At the fourth week, few cells of splanchnopleural mesoderm forms a secondary heart field. Our heart develops from the mesoderm. Right ventricle and outflow tracts develops from the secondary heart field. Okay. And rest of the entire heart develops from the primary heart field. In the second phase, you're going to find formation of the heart tube. Endoderm of primitive pharynx induces vasculogenesis in the primary heart field area. In the right side, left side endothelial heart tubes, and it also forms the endocardium. Now what happens? At the end of the third week, both right-sided and left-sided heart tube merges together, but their terminal end remains bifurcated. Okay, as you can see in this photo. Now, upper part or the cranial end gradually converts into arterial end or the arterial part, and the below part or the caudal end gradually converts into venous end. Okay. Now, third phase, heart tube dilatation. So, as I said, it has two parts. One is arterial end and venous end. Arterial end cranially, venous end caudally. Now, from the arterial end, we are getting the bulbus cordis, and from the venous end, we are getting the sinus venosus. Okay, and in the middle part of this dilatation area of the heart tube, we are getting the primitive ventricle and primitive atrium. Okay, now this bulbus cordis forms three things. One is truncus arteriosus, then conus cordis and bulbar part. From the truncus arteriosus, ascending aorta and pulmonary trunk develops. From the conus cordis, smooth part of the both, right and left ventricle develops. From the bulbar part, only rough part of the right ventricle develops. Okay. From the primitive ventricle, only rough part of the left ventricle develops. From the primitive atrium, rough part of the both, right and left atrium develops. And from the sinus venosus, we are getting the right horn, left horn. From the right horn, we are getting the smooth part of the both, right side and left sided atrium. And from the left horn, we are getting the coronary sinus and oblique vein of the left atrium. That's it. Now, fourth phase, formation of the external features of the adult heart. Okay. Initially, heart tube stays longitudinally in the pericardial cavity and it hangs through the dorsal mesocardium. Bulboventricular sulcus separates the bulbus cordis and primitive ventricle, and it forms a bulboventricular loop. Development of the transverse sinus leads disappearance of the dorsal mesocardium. For that reason, this bulboventricular loop distorted and forms a S-shaped loop. Okay. Now, due to this S-shaped loop formation, sinus venosus and primitive atrium also involves in this thing. Okay. Now, the bulboventricular sulcus gradually disappears and forms a single ventricle on each side, right side, left side. Ultimately, ventricles also fuses together, atrium also fuses together, and side by side auricles also form. Now the fifth phase, which is the formation of the atrium. We have two atrium in our heart, one is right side and left side. Now this right sided atrium consists of four parts: primitive atrium, sinus venosus, right venous bulb and atrioventricular canal. Primitive atrium forms rough part of the right atrium and right auricle. Sinus venosus forms the smooth part of the right atrium. Right venous valve forms the crista terminalis, infraventricular valves, and valves of the coronary sinus. This atrioventricular canal forms the small anterior smooth portion of the right atrium. That's it. This left atrium consists of 3 points: primitive atrium, pulmonary vein, and atrioventricular canal. Primitive atrium forms the rough part of the left atrium and left auricle. This pulmonary vein forms the posterior smooth part of the left atrium, and the atrioventricular canal forms the anterior minor smooth part of the left atrium. That's it. Now one extra knowledge point is fusion of the right venous valve and left venous valve forms the septum spurium. This septum spurium ultimately forms the interatrial septum cranially, and this thing also forms the sinus septum, which ultimately converts into interventricular septum caudally. After the development of the atrium, you have to understand formation of the ventricles in 6th phase, rough part and smooth part. Rough part comes from the primitive ventricle and smooth part comes from the infundibulum of the right ventricle and aortic vestibule of the left ventricle. That's it. The development of the interatrial septum, a septum or wall in between two atria in the 7th phase. What it means, at the end of the 4th week, septum spurium and primitive atrium forms a septum primum and sinoatrial opening, and gradually the septum primum grows towards AV cushion. AV cushion is also known as septum intermedium. Okay. Now, while it grows towards the AV cushion, it forms a sickle-shaped pattern. Okay. From there, a gap appears in between septum primum and septum intermedium, which is AV cushion. Now this gap is known as ostium primum, which is also known as foramina primum, as you can see in this photo. Septum primum ultimately fuses with the septum intermedium, which closes the newly formed foramina primum or ostium primum. But another small gap again reappears, which is known as foramen secundum. For this, another septum arises from the roof of the primitive atrium, which is known as septum secundum, and stays in between septum spurium and septum primum. Septum secundum gradually converts into foramen ovale. After birth, within few minutes, this foramen ovale get closes and septum secundum forms annulus ovalis. Okay. Now one thing you have to understand that, which I will talk about later, but still, before birth, this foramen ovale allows the blood directly goes into the left atrium from the right atrium. Now after birth, within few minutes, this process stops due to the pulmonary circulation begins. Well, I'll talk about these things later, you will not understand now. 8th phase, which is the formation of the interventricular septum. What is this? This forms from 3 parts. One is muscular part, bulbar part, and membranous part. Interventricular septum means a septum or wall in between right and left ventricle. Okay. So the muscular part develops from the muscular ridges from the bulboventricular cavity, and the bulbar part forms or develops from the right and left bulbar ridges from the conus cordis. Now this conus cordis is also known as conus septum. Anyway, this muscular part and bulbar part together has common communication gap in between right and left ventricle, which is known as interventricular foramen. So there is another foramen in between two ventricles. Okay. Now third point is the membranous part. This membranous part develops from the proliferation of the atrioventricular cushions, which ultimately causes the interventricular foramen at the 8th week of intrauterine life. Now extra knowledge point, as I said, in the 3rd phase of the heart tube dilation, it gives 4 parts: bulbus cordis, primitive ventricle, primitive atrium, and sinus venosus. So the heart tube has 2 ends, arterial end and venous end. In the arterial end, we have the truncus arteriosus. Now this truncus arteriosus gives right and left limbs. These limbs ultimately joins with the pharyngeal arch arteries. There are some arteries developed from the pharyngeal arch. Okay. And the venous end, we are having the sinus venosus, which gives the right and left horn. Now from these both horn, we are getting the right and left common cardinal vein, right and left umbilical vein, right and left bytheran vein, which ultimately connects with the yolk sac. Okay. From that point, you have to understand that right common cardinal vein gradually forms the superior vena cava, and arch of azygous vein. Left common cardinal vein gradually disappears in the 10th week of intrauterine life, but in few books or the latest data it says it forms the coronary sinus. Okay, right vitelline vein forms the inferior vena cava. Left vitelline vein forms the or it merges with the right umbilical vein, and it gradually obliterates in the or disappears within 5th week of intrauterine life. Okay, and the remaining left umbilical vein converts into ductus venosus, and gradually it converts into ligamentum teres for the liver. Okay, now communication in between primitive atrium and primitive ventricle is known as atrioventricular canal. Two atrioventricular cushions appears due to the thickening of the subendocardial mesenchymal cells, formation of the jelly-like substance. Okay, now this jelly-like substance gradually converts into endocardial cushion and forms myocardium. Atrioventricular cushions grows and fuses with each other to form septum intermedium, ultimately divides the atrioventricular canal into two half, one is right side and left side. Neural crest cells also contributes to form subendocardial cushion and endocardium, and a spiral septum develops in between the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, known as aorticopulmonary septum. In the 9th phase of cardiovascular system development, there is the formation of the valves and pericardium. Valves mean in our heart there are so many valves. See, excavation of the subendocardial cushions forms the cusp or leaflets around the atrioventricular canal, right side, left side. Okay, free margins of this cusp or leaflet gets connected with the chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles of the ventricular wall. What is chordae tendineae? I talked about these things in my heart anatomy videos. You know that. What is papillary muscles? You also know that. On the right side there is a three cusp, so we have the tricuspid valve, and on the left side we have two cusp, it is known as bicuspid or mitral valve. Another thing, as I said, that a spiral septum develops in between the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, which is known as aorticopulmonary septum. See, the separation of this pulmonary trunk from the aorta due to transposition by the spiral septum, which leads the fused subendocardial cushion, also shifts and deposits into the root of the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. Which was right side, it directly go to the left side. Which was already in left side, it comes to the right side. Anyway, and it deposits into the root of the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. Gradually again these things excavates, and same process just like this valve forms aortic valve and pulmonary valve. Serous pericardium arises from the splenopleurotic mesoderm and somatopleuric mesoderm. Done. Fibrous pericardium develops from the somatopleuric mesoderm and septum transversum. Done. All these things, both things merges together and forms ultimately adult pericardium. That's all. 10th phase or the final phase, development of the conducting system of the heart. Formation of the SA node or sinoatrial node. It develops at 5th week of the intrauterine life due to incorporation of the sinus venosus. This SA node shift from right wall to the just near to the superior vena cava opening. Okay. Now atrioventricular node and bundle of His. This thing originates from the interatrial septum at the end of the 5th week of intrauterine life and presents just near to the opening of coronary sinus. Now lots of avinodal cells continues up to the interventricular septum and forms bundle of His. Purkinje fibers. These fibers arises from the atrioventricular bundle, AB bundle or bundle of His, and it splits into the right and left ventricular bundle branches and supplies throughout the whole myocardium of both, right side, left side ventricles. Okay. At the beginning of the 6th week of intrauterine life, heart starts beating. Okay. Dub, 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 dub. So it's the first working or activated organ in the human body. So this is the overall development of the cardiovascular system part 1. I hope you really will understand, and see you in my next video. Till then, bye.